Hey everyone, sorry I won't be with you today. They're doing some work on the roof of my building and they need to access it through my apartment. I wanted to quickly share you an example of some student work that I got already for the Paris Livability project and walk you through kind of what I'll be looking for when I look at your project. So this group chose to do banning cars in Paris, and the first thing I can show you is that they went back into the banning cars lesson, which took place in Oslo, and they found the positive and negative points that were presented in that lesson. So that's a check right there, done, and that's something that I'm looking for in all of your presentations, that you identify the positive and negative points in the original lesson, whether that's Oslo, San Francisco, or India. The next thing they did is talk about how to fix the negative points, and that's another thing you have to do. And so this is another example of how this group did what they needed to do in order to get full credit. So again, they looked at the positive and negative points that were presented in the project as it was presented in the lesson, and then they talked about how to fix those negative points. Next, they talked about how to adapt the project specifically to Paris, which is something that I'm specifically looking for. And they talked about particular streets and Vélib and things like that that we have here in Paris. So they followed the first three steps perfectly. Identify the original lesson, positive and negative, fix the negatives, and then talk about fixing it so that it applies specifically to Paris. And then they moved on to talking about who would be responsible for the project, who would fund the project, meaning who would pay for it, and where it would start. So they talked about a project management team elected by City Hall, funds being public and private, and that they would start at Ile-Saint-Louis, which might be the easiest to ban cars because there aren't very many cars to begin with, and then work out eventually getting to the suburbs of Paris. So just one more time before we go towards the end, we have identifying the positive and negatives from the original lesson, whether it's Oslo, San Francisco, or India, talking about how you would fix those negative points, adapting it specifically to Paris, discussing who would be responsible and who would pay for it, and also how it would be implemented. And then finally, how would it be adapted to things like deconfinement and the eventual going back to work, going back to school that we're going through at the moment in France. And so they talked about the current issues like hand sanitizing, wearing masks, and they even presented a sanitation walkthrough station, which I thought was a very interesting idea, very neat. And these are ways to adapt to the current situation. So if we just quickly walk through one more time, you'll see that they hit every point that they need to in order to get credit for all the parts of the project. They first identified the positive and negative parts of the original lesson. They then talked about, sorry for the banging in the background, they're working as I said, talked about how they were going to fix the negative points of that lesson, then how they would adapt it specifically to Paris. Next, who would be responsible and who would fund it, how it would be implemented from inside out, outside in, where it would start, where it would finish, and then how it would be impacted by the current situation in the world and what we would do in order to adapt it to the current situation in the world. So this is just one example. Yours may have more information, less information, and you could still have full credit, but this is one example of a group that included everything they needed to. And so just make sure to check your projects before you send them in to me on Friday. So use this time, we're on day 5 of the project, to finish up your presentations, record them if you want to, and if not, you can send those to me, make sure I have them by Friday. Have a good day, can't wait to see your plans.